Hi everyone, my name is Tatiana and I will be talking about juveniles' treatment and experiences within the criminal justice system. I chose Chapter 8, titled All God's Children, from the book Just Mercy, written by Brian Stevenson, for my presentation today. So I will be summarizing the chapter using the people that Stevenson tells the stories of. He begins the chapter by sharing a poem in which Manuel, an inmate who was incarcerated as a juvenile, writes about his emotions and feelings of imprisonment in his own mind. This poem that he writes about his emotions and conscious being two different entities that try to come to terms with each other through acceptance and release. After the poem, Stevenson begins to tell the story of Trina Garnett, who was sentenced to life in prison for an accident that had happened when she was younger. Stevenson provides the audience with a background of her life, and he explains that she was abused when she was 9 years old, and then she developed serious mental and physical disabilities from a few dangerous incidents that happened when she was younger. She ended up becoming homeless at age 14, and she was sent to an adult women's prison at age 16 for accidentally causing two boys' deaths in a fire. And at the prison, a male correctional officer took advantage of her, got her pregnant, and then she was forced to give birth to her son, shackled to a bed, who was immediately placed in foster care. Her deteriorating health caused by her traumas and experiences remain with her as she continues to live her life in prison today. The next juvenile talked about in the chapter is Manuel, the same boy who wrote the poem at the beginning of the chapter. He and some older boys attempted to rob a couple, and when the woman resisted, Ian shot her in the jaw and she was seriously injured. It's important to note here that the gun was given to a 13-year-old Ian by the older boys as well. His lawyer was incredibly inexperienced and told him to plead guilty without knowing the other charges that Ian was facing, and due to his lawyer's negligence, Ian was forced into solitary confinement in an adult prison for 18 years. He ended up befriending the lady who he had harmed, and she actually advocated for his punishment to be lessened. And she really understood that this child had no supervision, lots of problems, and no available help to him. And the courts ended up ignoring her. So at 14 years old, or the next juvenile, at 14 years old, Antonio Nunez was given a life sentence for a fake kidnapping and attempted murder of a police officer. And he had lost his older brother, and he was injured with a drive-by shooting. And he was actually sent to live with his relatives, where his behavior got a lot better. But his parole officer, I believe, summoned him back to California, and he got involved in the crime that caused him to get a life sentence at 14 years old. So, the next part of the chapter, Stevenson argues that Black youth have always been criminalized and proceeds to tell the story of 14-year-old George Stinney. In Stinney's attempt to help authorities locate two little girls that had gone missing, by providing information on where he had seen them, which was by a river picking flowers, he became a prime suspect in their disappearance. George was executed for charges of rape and murder, and years later, a white man from a well-known family confessed to two girls' murder on his deathbed. So Stevenson writes about his efforts both legally and by attempting to improve the quality of Ian, Trina, and Antonio's life. He helps Trina arrange for her to meet her son, sends books to Antonio, who had a strong desire to learn, despite the fact that it was super challenging for him. He also learned that Ian was very smart and sensitive and asked if he could have a photographer take pictures for an article. Ian would send Stevenson poems and letters that he found, and Stevenson describes them as thoughtful and sobering. So for the last part of the chapter, Ian's thank you, Stevenson ends it with the thank you letter that Ian sends him for sending the photographer to take pictures of him. He explains how this made him feel alive and pours a lot of emotion into his letter. He pleads for more pictures and offers to pay for them, and he also states that he wants pictures almost as bad as he wants his freedom. So the first chapter I chose, the paraphrased quote When Stevenson sends a photographer to take photos of Ian was overjoyed with the photos. After being locked up for so long, the photos brought back emotions and a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in a long time. He even says he wants more photos almost as bad as he wants his freedom. So, an analysis of that passage, I think the words "buried me alive" portrays a grim perspective of being incarcerated for such a long amount of time with no human contact. The use of exclamation within the letter also really portrays how excited he is and brings his voice alive. And the manner in which he writes, since he's been in solitary confinement for so long, he took writing and poetry as a hobby. And this connects back to the poem that was used at the beginning of the chapter, that he just really likes to write and he's just really good at it. So the second passage, the paraphrase quote, "Minority, children, and young men are targeted by cops due to deep-rooted systemic racism. This is much higher in communities where gang violence is more affluent, and that tends to be in poorer areas. Law enforcement tend to enforce petty crimes more heavily on these people, and this only jumpstarts a criminal record for young men and women as well." So an analysis of passage 2, children and young adults of color fall victim to police assumption that they've done something illegal due to the color of their skin. Many of these people have no reason to be stopped and aren't given proper justification and not granted due process. Stevenson mentions this as Antonio is faced with paranoia from the area where his brother is killed and how he's subject to circumstances of his environment, as many children are. So for my first outside source, I chose an article titled "Children in Adult Prisons," written by Shontae Sadler. I felt that it really supported what we've been seeing with the treatment of juveniles in this chapter, and the following statistic is from the article, and it says that juveniles are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in adult prisons than juvenile facilities. Adult inmates and guards prey on juveniles because they are weak and vulnerable. Children also face an increased risk of suicide. They are 36 times more likely to commit suicide in an adult prison rather than a juvenile detention center. I felt this relates directly back to how Trina was taken advantage of by the male correctional officer in the adult women's prison, and how Ian would hurt himself in solitary confinement due to his mental health deteriorating. Stevenson says this is a serious and ongoing issue within the criminal justice system. So for my second outside source, it's a YouTube video titled 18 Years in Solitary Confinement and Befriending the Woman He Shot, Manuel, on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. I felt this was a very powerful source because it was posted pretty recently, 2 weeks ago, and this video brought what was written in the book Just Mercy to life. It's very different seeing an actual person and the person who's experiencing these things in a video and being interviewed. So, and I thought a really powerful quote that Manuel said within the video was, "We as human beings begin to evolve and we become different people. So to say to a child that you will never change is scientifically untrue. It's proven through science that we develop and we grow." So that was very important to the argument that children should be given second chances. Oops. So to conclude my presentation, what are some things that we can do? So I think it's very important to understand the influence that adults have on children, teenagers, and young adults' behavior. And we should be aware of the fact that this is an ongoing and very real problem that is hidden behind jail walls and courtrooms. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. Children in impoverished areas and children of color are targeted by the system. And we should also be more aware of bills and laws that protect incarcerated children and juveniles. And we should use our power to vote and vote. Thank you for watching.